So I was with Cruz basically at the beginning of the entire pandemic thing, when nobody knew how bad it is going to be or how long it would last. And while I was there, I was working on my PhD, which is about 3D approaches in the context of Cypro-Minoan writing. So basically what I'm doing is that I'm documenting as much as possible of the corpus in a high resolution 3D, and I'm creating a very comprehensive sign catalog and then analyzing it paleographically. And so today I'm going to talk about an aspect of this, which is about Ductus, which is particularly interesting in Cypro-Minoan just because of the high diversity in material and object type and inscription technique that we can find. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the different stroke types and in what context they are used and for what purposes. And before I begin, I want to just briefly define what Ductus is for me, because it's a bit of an ambiguous term depending on from what school you're coming from. And so for me, it's the practical execution of the abstract shape of a sign or variant. And so in that context, of course, stroke type is very important. And I see stroke type as the expression of tool movement, so of pressure and direction. And I'm not talking about stroke type as in the outline of the stroke. For example, the typical oval drop-like shape that we associate with Cypro-Minoan, or the triangular shape that we have in cuneiform. So within Cypro-Minoan, we have three different stroke types, as if stroke type is understood in this way. And one is linear, meaning I have a uniform direction and a uniform pressure. So this is an example, of course. And a subtype of that would be dots. And I put them in the same level because a dot is essentially an extremely short stroke. And I equate this as well because when you look at the entire signery and all the variants, you notice quickly that in the same sign, you can exchange a short linear stroke with a dot. And the second type would be a curved stroke, where you have a uniform pressure, but a uniform change in direction. And here you can see an example. And finally, the last type is a stroke that I call composite, because it basically has multiple parts. So you have a sudden change in direction and or in pressure. And here is an example of what I mean with this, where you can you see my mouse? Yes, I hope so. Where you have one part where the tool is held at one specific angle, and then you have a change in the angle and in the direction of the stroke and the pressure. But when you look closely at the 3D, you can see that this was made without lifting the tool from the surface. It made in one movement. And here you can see three examples of this. And of course, this is related to material. So you can do this only in soft clay, or you could also do it in wax, of course. And we can see it in painted inscriptions as well. And here we have a subtype, which I call complex composite, because it has multiple parts. Again, either only in pressure. So we have 1, 2, or 3. I don't know if you can see it here in 2D, but in 3D, it's very clearly distinguishable. And the same here, or you have multiple changes in direction, but about the same pressure that is being executed on the material. And now when you look at the percentages of all the strokes within the corpus, you can clearly see that linear is still very much the preferred one with 89%. And then the next one with 8% is linear composite stroke, followed by complex composite, dot, and curved, with each about 1%. And now we are going through each of these types and see in what context they occur and also their geographical and chronological distribution. I won't talk anymore about the linear strokes, just because they can be executed on any material and on any object type, and you can find them anywhere, and they don't provide any further information. And that's why I will focus on the other ones. And we're going to look at first at the curved strokes. And we have about 70 examples of signs where we have curved line. And interestingly, we can find that both in hard and in soft material, even though there's, of course, a preference for soft material, just because it's easier to do. But there's also an example in stone, for example. And we can see this preference for soft material in sign number 15, where you have one variant, the first variant 1, where you have clearly curved and which you can mostly see in the clay balls. And then in variant 2, it becomes an angled line, and this is mostly used in bronze or in stone. And we can find these examples of curved strokes mostly in relation of these signs, so 15, 39, 52, 59, and 74. And the similarity that they have is that they have at least one long line with a change in direction. But here I have to say that they can also be executed with a linear composite stroke, as we will see later on, or with two separate, just normal linear strokes like we can see here with the variant 2. Then we move on to dots. Dots, we have more than 90 examples. And it's also used on every material, even though you would think that maybe it's primarily used in a clay, just because it's easier, just turn the stylus around and dip it in. But we can see it in stone. This is also the example that I mentioned before of a curved line on stone, on metal, ivory, and also on hard clay. And it is used in context of 13 signs. And now we are going to look at the distribution. So these are all the variants that show a dot in their composition. And as you can see, it is found basically everywhere where we have Cypro-Minoan inscriptions, with a lot more in Encrome, but that is to be expected because we have so much more inscriptions from there. We also see it in Ugarit. And then when we look at the chronological distribution, it also follows exactly the distribution of the corpus as a whole, meaning that we have very few examples in the beginning of the late Cypriot Bronze Age and very few at the end and at the beginning of the Iron Age, and a huge peak in the middle. So, and this is telling us essentially that throughout the use of Cypro-Minoan, it was completely normal to switch between dot or short linear strokes. And even in the northern part of the island, where we have only 10% of the inscriptions coming from there, even there we have examples of this dot use. So it's really a testament of the diversity within Cypro-Minoan. And now we move on to the really interesting one, the composite strokes. And here we have, again, to distinguish between different purposes. The majority of them, so 72%, are used to render curves and angles, and then 9% to render two lines that are, so two lines that are in the base shape of the sign divided or rendered in one movement. So it's a way of abbreviating or simplifying the sign. These are 9%, and then 15% to render different levels of depth within one line without changing the direction. And finally, a 4%, which is other, meaning that with those examples, it's not very clear if it was used deliberately or just accidentally. And now I've explained better what I mean with each one of these purposes, and we are going to start with angle and inclination. So these are examples of signs where you would find a linear composite stroke to render a long angled line in the base composition. And these are very similar to the ones where you would find also curved stroke, like here it's the same variant, only one's executed with a curved one and one's with a linear composite one with a clear change in direction and pressure. And then the second type is simply rendering a line which is in the base composition or in the base shape of the sign, an inclined line. So not horizontal and not vertical. And this is a very subtle change in the movement of the stylus, and that you only see clearly when you try to apply a straight line on top of it. And you see that with the tool, there was like really slight movement. And it's interesting because you wonder why they just didn't make a single straight line and decided to make the slide angle. Even though it seems more complicated, maybe Pippa has some ideas about this since she tried to has made experiments on the clay balls. And then we move on to the multi-depth linear composite strokes. And here we have loads. As you can see, there are more than 80 examples in total across 18 different signs. And we can make two groups here. The first group is this one. And the majority, so more than half of these 80 examples are related to these variants. And what they have in common is that they are all made on the same stroke. So it's always this central vertical line where we have the upper part, which is very shallow and thin, and then a lower part, which is deeper and wider. But you can also see very clearly that it was made with one movement. And I say that this is the stylistic element because it's made exactly in the same way across multiple different signs and across multiple different objects. And we are going to associate this with enchyme then in the next slide. And then in the second group, this is much rarer. And these are more experiments, I would say, because they're not this uniform. Each of them have only one example, a part of 102 and 110. And it also occurs, interestingly, on the word divider. And we are going to see what purpose this might have later on. And now to the geographical distribution. We are going to start first with those upper group with the stylistic ones. And you can see that they're clearly concentrated in enchyme, but we have also examples in Ugarit and possibly one from Pilakopinocremos. And they start in LC2 on the clay cylinder 97, and then we have a clay ball, another one that is not plated. Then we see it on the tablets in Ugarit, and then again back in enchyme on the famous tablets that are grouped together as CM2. So this seems to be a stylistic element that appears first in LC2, and it was then continued to be used until the end of Cypro-Minoan Writing. And then the other group is associated only to clay balls. And as you can see, they're very much concentrated, obviously again on enchyme, with one example from Hala Sultan Dike on the word divider. And they're very much concentrated again towards the end of the late Cypriot Bronze Age. And I think their experimentation towards either more complexity or more simplicity, and I will explain better what I mean with that. But basically, when you look at all the other variants of these signs, you notice that the different parts that are rendered different depths are in other variants completely separate strokes. So 2 different lines instead of 1. And I will explain this on sign number 5. So the standard variant, which has by far the most examples, is just 2, a vertical line and a horizontal line across each other. Then you have a variant where where the vertical line is made with 2 separate strokes. And then we have ours with the different levels of depth, which is made in 1 movement, but you see clearly there's a change in pressure, which would give me the idea that there is, another sign where they're separate, which indeed exists. But then there's the question if this indicates an experiment to make it faster or more complex, because we have both a more complex sign and we have a simpler sign. So what was the purpose of this? And we have a similar situation in the word divider, where by far the most standard version is this just simple vertical line. We have also seen with Cassie before. Then we have the multi-depth variant, where we have 9 examples. And we also have 3 examples where they become 2 separate strokes. So here we have again the same situation where we don't know if this the multi-depth stroke, if it was trying to simplify this one or if it was trying to make this one more fancy. And then we can use this further to think about if we can use these multi-depth lines as a predictor for variants that we haven't discovered yet, or where we don't have examples. And so for sign 102, the standard variant has these outer lines just as 2 separate linear strokes. And the same with sign 110. But then we have these multi-depth examples where you can see clearly that there were attempts to make it seem like it was made with different shorter strokes. And this makes me think of sign number 85, where we actually have these very short strokes in a succession to make a line. And interestingly, with sign 85, we also have 2 variants where we have a composite stroke that was used to simplify the line or to make a faster writing mode, because there were 2, they didn't want to spend all this time making a separate stroke. And this brings us to the last use of composite strokes, meaning to make 2 lines that are separate in the base composition in 1 movement. And this is the rarest use of composite strokes, where we have only 33 examples across 27 objects and in relation to 8 different signs. And I already showed you sign number 85 with 2 variants that have this type of stroke. And now I will explain it also better on sign number 82, which also has 2 variants. So the standard variant here it looks like this. And where we have 3 separate lines arranged in a triangle. And we have one variant where then the left upper line and the lower vertical line are made with 1 movement. And then we have the other variant where it is on the other side. And here the sign was simplified to a V even, but as you can see, the scribe took care to really emphasize this lower part to render this vertical line still in a way, which really tells you something about what was the core thing that would be that a person needed to see in order to recognize the sign. And which makes me also wonder whether the variant 4 that is currently there for sign 82 really is a variant of this or not, because the emphasis on this vertical line is completely missing. And if we look at the distribution of these, we can again see a very close association of encomy, but we also have examples from Calabasas, Ayosimitrios. And from a chronological point of view, we have a peak in LC2, and then again towards the end of the late Cypriot Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. And then if we look at the kinds of objects, we can see that these correlate with the clay cylinders in Calabasas and in encomy. And the other ones are again our clay balls. And if we look at the size of the inscriptions on both objects, that could give us a clue of why these types of strokes were used in this context. Where for the clay balls, we have an average dimension of the signs, which is millimeters in width and millimeters in height. And in the cylinders, it's about half, so 3.5 millimeters in width and 4 millimeters in height. And I think that for the cylinders, the two-line one mode was used as a strategy to adapt to tiny signs that are on the cylinders. Whereas on the clay balls, I don't think it is related to the size, but more just an experimentation to find a way to write faster. And in summary, what are the most important takeaways? That the linear strokes are by far the most dominant ones. Dots are independent of material and object type, and they're used throughout Cypro-Minoan writing interchangeably with the short linear stroke. And then for composite strokes that are used to render angles or curves most of the times, but in the case of multi-depth and two lines in one, the situation becomes a bit more interesting, where for multi-depth strokes, it can either be a stylistic element that is typical for encomy, but which has also some connections to Uberit and possibly Pelagochinopremus. And we can see it also as an experimentation towards a greater simplicity or complexity in the clay balls towards the end of late Cypriot Bronze Age. And the same is again for the clay balls in the instances of two lines in one. And for the cylinders, it is, as I said, more likely a strategy to adapt to the size. So with this, I end. I want to thank the Atlantic Cruise members for inviting me back and giving me a chance to talk about some of the results of my PhD.